I want to first start out with a little bit of an introduction about how I got to where I am today with the Hebrew. It started, well, I guess as a child. I was raised in the Lutheran church. My dad was a minister. And so I learned Lutheran doctrine, Lutheran teachings. And one thing about some churches, like the Lutherans, they don't really teach you to study the Bible. The pastors tell you what the Bible says. That's their function. And your job is to sit there and nod your head. Okay. Well, then I met my wife in 1990, and she was attending a Assembly of God church. So I started going to church with her. And I saw that they believed things differently than I was taught. I'm like, wait, that's not what I was taught. What is this? So I realized that the only way that I'm going to come down to the truth was to study for myself. So I opened up my Bible really almost for the first time. And I started studying, and I studied. And I got to a verse like this. I was studying Genesis, and it says in the King James, "And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures." Okay, living. So one of the first things I did was I got a Strong's Concordance. How many here use Strong's Concordance? Put your hand up. I can't see. Okay, about half, I'd say. Okay, so I got a Strong's Concordance, and I started looking up these words, and I came across the word living. And it is the number 2416, chai. And it means alive, raw, fresh. And these are the different ways that this one word is translated. Age, alive, appetite, beast, company, congregation, life, live, living, creature, thing, maintenance, merry, multitude, old, quick, running, springing, and true. Wow, that's an awful lot for one little Hebrew word. Does it really mean all of that? So anyway, I continued on, and I looked at the word creature. And in the Strong's, that's nephesh, and this word was translated as any appetite. Wait a minute, appetite. Well, that was also in chai too. Beast, body, breath, creature, dead, desire, contented, fish, and the list goes on and on and on. Wow, that's an awful lot of words for this one little Hebrew word. But that was interesting. Okay, so nephesh, chai. It's a phrase in the Hebrew. And I continued reading and studying, and then came across Genesis 2, verse 7. Now before I continue on, let me ask you this. How many of you believe you have a soul? Raise your hand if you believe you have a soul. Well, not very many of you. Raise your hand if you believe you have a soul. Do you have a soul? Okay, I think everybody. How many of you believe animals have a soul? Not quite as many hands, but a few. Okay, all right. So, Genesis 2, verse 7, we come across the word living again, and it's the same Hebrew word chai. Come to the word soul, and it is also the same Hebrew word nephesh chai. And I'm like, wait a minute, okay, nephesh chai is translated as living creature here, and nephesh chai is translated as living soul here. As I understood it, only humans had a soul, animals didn't have a soul, but that's not what I'm reading here. So something's wrong with this translation that I'm reading from. So I got more into the Strong's Concordance, looking up different Hebrew words, trying to understand what the text was saying. And this frustrated me. It was almost like I'm playing a game here and they keep changing the rules on me. They're going to translate one word this way here, but then they're going to translate it differently over here, but it's the same word. Why translate it differently? That frustrated me. I felt like they were changing the rules on me in the game. So I decided I got to learn Hebrew. Well, actually, I started learning Greek before this, by the way. Not a lot of people know this, but I was a good Christian boy. I got to learn Greek, because that's what the New Testament was written. And I studied it for about 6 months and got deathly bored with it. I was like, oh, that's it. I'm done with that. And then I wound up picking up the Hebrew. And I've been on that ever since for the last 20-some-odd years. Just fell in love with the language. So my introduction after Strong's is where I started. I picked up an Interlinear Bible. And an Interlinear Bible has How many people are not familiar with an interlinear? I think everybody is. Anybody not familiar with an interlinear? Okay. An interlinear has the Hebrew text, like a Hebrew, this is Bereshit, the very first word in the Bible, Bereshit. And then underneath it, it'll give you a translation of it. Same thing with every single word. It'll give you a translation of each Hebrew word. Now, this is Kohlenberger's interlinear, and it's the translation over here is the NIV, the New International Version. And it pretty much, it translates it according to the NIV, so it's not real accurate, you know. But it helped. It got me an introduction into Hebrew, started learning. And Kohlenberger's interlinear has at the beginning a chart that had the Hebrew letters and what their pronunciations were. And there was also a chart there for the vowel pointings. So I kind of started learning how to pronounce the Hebrew words using this chart. And there was also a lot of introductory information about the Hebrew language. So I was really getting intrigued here. This Hebrew language is very interesting. It's a little different than English. So I started learning more and more and more. Then I had a friend of mine who was a Jew who attended a local synagogue. And he said, hey, I understand you're starting to learn Hebrew. I go, yeah. And he says, would you be interested in our Hebrew class? We're starting up a new Hebrew class. And I go, yeah, I'm in. So he and I drove down. It was every Wednesday night for about 3 months or so. And at the end of that, I could then read this. Now, I didn't have full comprehension at the point, you know, but I could read the Hebrew. This is the Hebrew Bible. And I was really excited. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim v'et haaretz. I was so excited I was able to read Hebrew. And then I started with Strong, started learning what the definitions of the words are. But then I noticed an article in our local paper. This was in 1997, I think. And evidence of Solomon's temple found. And basically the article is saying is that they found this ostraca, which is a broken piece of pottery with Hebrew writing on it. And I'm going, Hebrew writing? That's not Hebrew. What is this? So I thought, you know, I learned Hebrew, and this doesn't look anything like Hebrew. So that got me starting to research the older forms of the Hebrew language, and this is Paleo Hebrew. I'm going to look up. We'll be looking at that ostraca again a little bit later. So I started searching the internet, looking for what I come to find out that they call Paleo Hebrew. This was the writing before the modern Hebrew. This is the way Hebrew was written before the modern Hebrew. Came across this site where these two scholars, James Harris and I can't remember the other guy's name, they started cataloging these inscriptions that were found in Serabit el-Kadim, the Sinai Peninsula. And it has this alphabet, which they were calling Proto-Semitic. I thought, well, that's interesting, so I started researching that. And it turns out that this was the precursor to the Paleo Hebrew. So I first started learning the Hebrew, or modern Hebrew, then I found out about the Paleo Hebrew, and then I found out about what's called, quote, Proto-Semitic, which is the early pictograph, like what Teddy was talking about with the word kahal, the actual picture language, the hieroglyphs. So this got me started on the path of the ancient Hebrew. I joined a Messianic congregation that was in our area, and we got a lot of teachers in, and they also brought in a lot of materials from teachers from around the world, and one of them was Dr. James Fleming. It was a video of his. And he started explaining how this Hebrew word can only be understood in the culture of that day. Now, for the life of me, I cannot remember what that teaching was. But what impacted me is that we have to understand, if we're going to read the Bible, can we read it like a 20th century American? Can we read it from our cultural perspective? No, sir. No, sir. We cannot. Because it was written in a culture that's completely different from our own. And Dr. James Fleming's teachings opened up my eyes to understanding the Bible from the perspective. Now, I knew nothing about the Hebrew culture. Nothing. How was I supposed to understand the Bible if I don't understand the culture? So then I started getting into understanding the culture. By the way, Dr. Fleming now has a... anybody ever seen it in Georgia? I can't remember the name of it. He has a replica of an ancient Hebrew village, a Bedouin's tent, just like Abraham would have. He has all of these structures on his property that you can go and take tours and learn about their culture there. I have not been there. I do plan on going there sometime. But his teachings are phenomenal. If you can ever find some of his teachings, there's a lot of them on the internet. Dr. James Fleming, great stuff. Understanding to read the Bible from the perspective of the Hebrews who wrote it. Then I came across this book. Anybody ever read this book? Anybody in here seen or read this book? Okay. If you're interested in learning the difference between Hebrew and Greek culture, you got to get this book by Thorleif Bowman. It was originally written in German, but there's an English translation of it. Phenomenal book. It goes in and explains how our way of thinking is oftentimes 180 degrees different from the way the Hebrews think. And I will give some examples of that here in a bit. Our philosophy and our way of life, our culture, is nothing like the Hebrews. And if you read the Bible, interjecting your own personal perspectives, you're going to read it wrong. Bottom line, you're going to read it wrong. You have to be able to get into the culture of the Hebrews. And this was the process that I went through as I began learning about the Hebrew language. Then there was Dr. William Bean. He came to our Messianic Assembly many times. He's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, worked in Israel. He passed away a few years ago. But he also does a lot of work with the New Testament. So he started introducing me to the Hebraicness of the New Testament. And that got me interested. How many here have heard it said that the New Testament was originally written in Greek? How many of you have heard that? Okay, everybody's heard that. How many of you believe that the New Testament was originally written in Greek? Anybody? Nobody will admit it anyway.
I would say parts of it.
Parts of it. Okay, that's a very good, honest answer. One of the reasons why they teach that for the last hundreds of years is because they believe that the Hebrew language ended during the Babylonian captivity, and they started speaking Aramaic and Greek. And Greek was the language of the day for that area. He proved with one fragment of a parchment that is not true. This is a Bar Kokhba letter. Bar Kokhba was the general of the Jewish army in 135 AD who led the Jews against the Romans in the second revolt. Now we're all familiar with the first revolt in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. But the Jews stayed in the land. Even though they lost the war in 70 AD, they stayed in the land. But they rose up again and fought against the Romans in 135. At that point, after they lost that, the Romans kicked them out of the land. They were gone. But this is one of his letters. In fact, it says right here at the beginning, Met Shimon ben Kosba, from Simon. Shimon ben Kosba is his Hebrew name. In Aramaic it would be, or the Greco form would be Simon Bar Kokhba. If you look up at Wikipedia or any other resource, they'll call him Simon Bar Kokhba. But his Hebrew name was Shimon ben Kosba. And in this he uses a word right there. It's really kind of hard to read, but it's the word tashmayim. Tashmayim. There is no Hebrew word tashmayim. It doesn't exist. What is it? It's a colloquialism. Anybody know what a colloquialism is? Give me an example of a colloquialism that we use. Anybody? Reach back there to when you were in school learning English grammar. What's colloquialism? Anybody? This is one of the interesting things when I started. Oh, okay, I'll tell you a story. I'm going to go. When I was a little boy going to school, I was learning grammar, English grammar, and one of the things that we learned was the teacher was telling us what an article is in the English language. The articles in English are the, a, and an. Okay, very simple. But I went to my dad and I said, Dad, why do I need to know this? This is ridiculous. I'll never need to know what an article is. Why am I? And he sat there and I could see it in his face. He didn't come up with an answer. He scratched his head. He goes, well, you know what? One day your son is going to come to you and ask you, what is an article? And I said, Dad, why does he need to know what an article is? Okay. Fast forward 20, 30 years later, and I'm reading books about Hebrew grammar because I want to learn this language. And it says in Hebrew, the article is ha. Article. I know what that is. I knew what an article. But one of my biggest roadblocks when learning Hebrew was learning English, because they talk about prepositions and verbs and subjects and objects and all this stuff. I'm like, ooh, I forgot all that. I had to relearn English in order to learn Hebrew, because all the books use the same words that we use in the English language when it talks about grammar. But anyway, tashmayim is a colloquialism. An example in English would be isn't, aren't, can't, wouldn't. It's taking two words and jamming them together to make one word. That's a colloquialism. Now, it's a scientific fact that a colloquialism cannot be developed in a written language only. It can only be developed in a spoken language. Since he's using this colloquialism, that proves that that was the language he was speaking. Hebrew was the language that Shimon ben Kosba was speaking in 135 AD. Now, if you look at Wikipedia, it originally said about 10 years, 15 years ago when I was looking at it, when kind of Wikipedia was first starting out, it said that Hebrew ceased to be a language in the 3rd century BC. But then they revised that later within the last few years to say that Hebrew continued to be used even into the 2nd century. Why do they say that? Because of this right here. This proves that Hebrew was spoken in the 2nd century AD. Tashmayim is the combination of the words et, shamayim. What's shamayim?
Heavens.
Heavens. What's et?
Earth. No.
No. It's the marker. It marks the direct object of a verb. In Genesis 1 verse 1, Bereshith bara et hashamayim. Okay? So, but what they were doing in their language was jamming those together. Instead of saying et hashamayim, they made it tashmayim. It's like our words can't, wouldn't, would. Okay? So this was groundbreaking to me when I realized, wait a minute, the New Testament, they were speaking Hebrew, they were Jews. Was the New Testament originally written in Hebrew? Okay? Now, that's a big question. Do we have 100% proof that the New Testament was written in Hebrew? No. Do we have some evidence that it was? Yes. And I go into that on my website. I've got some videos on YouTube. And if we have the time or we wind up in there, we might be able to get into that here as well. Tomorrow, maybe. But anyway, this was eye-opening to me. And Dr. Bean opened up a whole new world to me when it comes to the New Testament. I have come to find out with the New Testament that I don't trust the Greek. Now, all of our English translations are based on the Greek. I believe that the New Testament was written in Hebrew, translated into Aramaic, then the Aramaic was translated into Greek, and then the Greek's translated into Hebrew. Anybody heard the word lost in translation, or the phrase lost in translation? Okay. So it was that process of finding these different aspects of Hebrew and different concepts within the Bible that led me on the path that I'm on today.